Alcatraz. It's known as the prison of all prisons. This intimidating structure filled prisoners across America with fear. No one wanted to be sent to this island fortress. Yet for those criminals that were too dangerous in normal prison, this was their home. Behind the reinforced bars and concrete walls, Alcatraz holds many dark mysteries. Guards have been accused by former inmates of taking many violent liberties. Today we're going to pull back the curtain and examine the secrets to this infamous penitentiary. All the way back in 1775, Spanish naval officer Juan Manuel de Ayala became the first European to sail in the San Francisco Bay. Whilst traversing the waters, he stumbled across a 22-acre island. He named the island La Isla de los Alcatraces, which translates as the Island of Pelicans. Later on, the name would be altered to become Alcatraz. The first owner of the island was Julian Workman in 1846. He was given the island by Alta California Governor Pio Pico. Workman was instructed to build a lighthouse on the secluded land. Yet before he could do so, the island was sold to California's military governor, John C. Fremont, for $5,000. With inflation, that's around $168,000 today. In 1850, Millard Fillmore, then President of the United States, ordered that Alcatraz be handed over to the military. They then turned the island into a military base. The military felt the island was the perfect location to defend the mainland. As a result, Fort Alcatraz was constructed. However, Fremont was never paid by the government, so he and the other ranch owners took the government to court. It wasn't until the late 1890s when a decision was made. The court declared Fremont had no right to the land and thus no compensation was paid out. The first prisoners on Alcatraz were captured soldiers in 1859. During the Spanish-American conflict in 1898, the military prison held over 450 people. In 1933, the remaining military areas on Alcatraz were decommissioned. From there, the island and prison facility were handed to the Prisons Bureau. It wouldn't be until 1934 when convicted civilians were imprisoned on the island prison. The warden in charge of this new prison was named James A. Johnston. He oversaw the first civilian prisoners admitted into Alcatraz. Those selected were either hand-picked due to the disruption they had caused in other jails, or from the threat they posed to guards and other inmates. Johnston had 155 guards to aid him in the early stages of Alcatraz prison. He ruled the facility with an iron fist. He instigated many strict rules to keep the prisoners in line. Alcatraz has been home to many famous criminals throughout the years, some of which have been portrayed on silver screen, such as Al Capone. Almost 30 years after its transformation from a military fort, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was closed in 1963. Not long after its prison formation, Alcatraz grew a reputation as an impossible facility to escape from. The prisoners knew very little about their current home, but they did know that they were separated from the mainland. After all, they did have to ride a ferry to get to Alcatraz. As the inmates were regularly watched and restricted with time outside, they couldn't explore the area too much. Since it's positioned on an island, if a person got out of the actual prison, they would have to swim to the mainland. The ocean around San Francisco Bay is very cold, with strong currents. Weak swimmers could easily be swept away or become overwhelmed by the icy water. Even if they could cope with that, the escapee would have to swim at least 1.25 miles to land, which is incredibly difficult in these conditions. More so when you have guards viewing the area in watchtowers. Officially, none of the 14 attempts to flee in Alcatraz's history successfully escaped. Those prisoners that made the attempt had to rely on their cunning and detailed planning. Many of said plans took many months to put together. The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris dug a tunnel through their respective cells in their attempt. But we'll chat more about that shortly. The other factor to consider when escaping were the cliffs on the island. They could be as high as 100 feet. Long after the prison had shut down and become a tourist hotspot, researchers from Binghamton University examined Alcatraz in 2019. They used technology to map the structures remaining from the island's forgotten Fort Alcatraz days. The technology used was terrestrial laser scans, ground-penetrating radar data, and georetrification. In layman's terms, georetrification is the process of taking images of old maps which are then layered in other maps. Through this research, Timothy DeSmet of his team discovered a series of hidden tunnels. They were described as, quote, a bomb-proof earthwork traverse, end quote. After all that time, the tunnels were still in perfect condition. There are ventilation shafts within the tunnels to make the journey through them more comfortable. The tunnels ran from east to west under the recreation yard of the prison. The researchers hope to use this technique to discover other lost architectural history. One of the most famous escape attempts from Alcatraz happened in December of 1962. John Paul Scott was a bank robber that was serving a 30-year stretch in Alcatraz. He teamed up with Darrell Lee Baker to escape. They pulled apart the bars from a window in a latrine and squeezed through the gap. Using a rope to climb down, they rushed to shore. They made water wings from inflated rubber gloves and began the 1.4-mile cross toward the mainland. However, Barker broke his ankle during the escape and had to give up. The guards found him on a small island nearby, yet Scott seemed to be successful. Later on, children phoned in about an unconscious man on the beach. Scott was arrested 3 miles from Alcatraz. The current had swept him way off course. He had hypothermia and was exhausted. He was immediately sent back to the island he broke out from. There's also the story we mentioned briefly earlier, the one involving Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin in June 1962. For months, the group had smuggled in makeshift tools to their cells. In secret, they dug a hole into an unguarded ventilation shaft that was hidden behind a fake vent. They waited until the night to break through their holes. They left papier-mâché heads in their beds to appear as though they were sleeping. They had stolen many raincoats and various materials over the months and used these to create life jackets and an inflatable raft. They had to climb over barbed wire fences to get to the shore. The trio then got onto the makeshift boat and sailed towards Angel Island, 2 miles from Alcatraz. The official investigation concluded that the escapees had perished in the water. However, the family of the infamous convicts believed they survived. For more details on this miraculous event, check out our video on the escape. As we mentioned, infamous gangster Al Capone once graced the halls of Alcatraz with his presence. Capone was a bootlegger that made a fortune selling illegal alcohol during America's Prohibition. At one point, the media had dubbed him Public Enemy Number 1. After struggling to prove Capone's serious offenses, the officials tried another method. Capone was arrested and found guilty for tax evasion. From there, he arrived in Atlanta Penitentiary. Once Alcatraz was open, Capone was shipped to the specialized prison. While on the island, he took up playing the banjo in a band. Another famous name is George Machine Gun Kelly. He was a notorious gangster that also took part in kidnapping and bootlegging. Like Capone, he too was dubbed Public Enemy Number 1. However, once he was sent to Alcatraz, his reputation changed drastically. He became Pop Gun Kelly. This was due to the fabricated stories he often told inmates about his history of crime. Life was difficult behind bars. After all, there's a reason Alcatraz was used as a threat to prisoners if they didn't behave. In the early days, socialization of the prisoners was kept at a bare minimum. If they spoke to each other outside of breaks, they could be put in isolation for long stretches of time. The inmates weren't even allowed to know about current events outside of the prison. Magazines and newspapers were banned. When the prisoners had a visitor, their guest was instructed not to talk about any news to the convict. The conversations were closely monitored. Yet a prisoner could only have a visitor once per month. Each convict had their own cell. However, the cells were small, at 5 feet deep and 9 feet wide. The prison was prepared in case any violence took place. Many room entrances of the facility had a metal detector installed. Throughout Alcatraz, remotely triggered tear gas canisters were installed. Guards worked 3 different shifts of either 7 hours or 10 hours depending on the time of day their shift fell on. The guards were heavily armed with machine guns, shotguns, pistols, and gas equipment in case anything happened. While Warden Johnston insisted his guards didn't beat the prisoners, many of the convicts claimed they were attacked with blackjacks. There were several riots at Alcatraz. One of the famous ones was dubbed the Battle of Alcatraz. This took place between May 2nd and May 4th of 1946. It happened as part of an escape plan created by Bernard Coy. A number of guards and inmates were injured in the conflict, some of which resulted in fatalities. Eventually, the warden regained control of his prison with the aid of the Marines and the Coast Guard. Many people assumed that the closure of the prison was due to the potential escape of Morris and the Anglin brothers. However, that decision was made a few months beforehand. The facility was deemed too expensive to continue operating. An estimate between $3 and $5 million was needed for restoration and maintenance work on Alcatraz. That figure was on top of the daily running costs. The costs per prisoner at Alcatraz in 1959 was $10.10. For comparison, in Atlanta, the cost per prisoner was $3 in the same year, making Alcatraz 3 times more expensive than all other federal penitentiaries. Most of that cost was due to what made the prison so intimidating: its island isolation. All resources, including gallons of fresh drinking water, had to be shipped across the San Francisco Bay. On March 21, 1963, the final 27 inmates left Alcatraz. They were relocated across the country to various maximum security prisons, finishing the chapter on the inescapable prison. But perhaps out in the world, Morris and the Anglin brothers chuckled to themselves as they heard the news. In 1978, the FBI officially closed the case on the missing trio, assuming that the 3 had perished in their escape. But in 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter that could provide some answers. This letter is said to have come from John Anglin. He mentions that he has cancer and is the only surviving member left from the three. He requested medical treatment in exchange for giving himself up, but neither the police nor the Bureau responded. For the next 5 years, the FBI analyzed the letter for fingerprints and DNA. The results were inconclusive. They were no closer to uncovering the truth. So the San Francisco Police Department and the FBI officially closed the case once again. In 2018, they released the letter to the public. Family were dismayed that this was kept from them for so long, because if it was indeed John Anglin, he'd been left untreated for his illness for years. In 2015, photographs emerged of the brothers apparently in Brazil in the 1970s. But is the letter a hoax, or could it have been the real deal? We'll let you decide in the comments below. And that's it. There's so much history on this storied prison. Many people today believe that Alcatraz is haunted by the guards and prisoners that once walked through the prison. Do you believe that's possible? Leave your answers in the comments below. If you haven't already, subscribe and click that little bell. That way, you'll be notified whenever we release new content. If you enjoyed the story and want more videos like this, then please give us a like and share this on social media. Finally, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.